Greetings, family, and welcome to another edition of KSOL Black Talk Radio, the new black media. Today is Saturday, March 16, 2019. Family, this video is about Dr. John Hope Franklin, where the question is asked, did Dr. John Hope Franklin want $100 trillion for blacks? Well, Dr. John Hope Franklin, the accomplished historian who documented blacks' place in the great American story, firmly believed in reparations. The idea that the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States should be compensated for the centuries of free labor that enriched slave owners and their descendants and the American empire. It is a fact overlooked by a flurry of other distractions in the media. Consider his response in 2007 to state legislators in North Carolina and Virginia who balked at apologies for slavery introduced by their peers. For him, a mere verbal apology wasn't enough. And family, let me pause right now that in 2019 or any of this time period, it's too late for an apology. You're a day late and $100 trillion short. That is a fact. It continues. People are running around apologizing for slavery, he said. What about that awful period since slavery? Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and all the rest. And what about the enormous wealth that was built up by black labor? I think that's little to pay for the gazillions that black people built up, the wealth of this country with their labor. And now you're going to say, I'm sorry, I beat the hell out of you for all these years? That's not enough. When Dr. Franklin spoke of history, he did so with the definitive authority of an expert who spent over half a century culling through the details. His accomplishments are legendary. Distinguished Duke University professor who taught at the University of Chicago and Harvard University, where he earned his doctorate in 1941. Author of 20 books. First African American to chair a history department at a predominantly white university, and over 3.5 million copies of his book, From Slavery to Freedom, have been printed since his 1947 publication. It is very easy now in our age of political correctness to courteously applaud the accomplishments of a barrier-breaking African American in the field of U.S. history, which he said he wrote without the embellishment of emotional display. But an entirely different pill to swallow is the conclusion he gleaned from his analysis. Reparations are essential to acknowledging the country's wrongs. Let me repeat. But an entirely different pill to swallow is the conclusion he gleaned from his analysis. Reparations are essential to acknowledging the country's wrongs. John Hope Franklin goes into different ways of how you could do it. He says, quote, there are all kinds of ways you could do it. What about scholarships? What about decent places for people to live? Out of the fortunes that were made, you could build a mansion for the descendant of every former slave. Others have argued that reparations should be paid directly by the U.S. government, which Harper's Magazine, back in November 2000, estimated at $100 trillion for 222,505,049 hours of forced labor between 1619 and 1865, with compounded interest of 6%. Family, did you hear those numbers? Because I think that as we've been talking about the discussion of reparations, there's been so many different ideas being thrown out there. And unfortunately, we're allowing the politicians to throw the ideas out there before we do. And since we are the ones who have led the discussion of reparations and brought it to the forefront and made mainstream media talk about it, I think it's to our best interest, ADOS family, it's to our best interest to demand what those reparations will be and not allow them to curtail it with their shenanigans like they always do. I think this is the time for us to have our agenda, the reparations agenda, and using the numbers that, again, Harper Magazine used back in November 2000, I think is a starting point where they used 222,505,049 hours of forced labor between 1619 and 1865 with compounded interest of 6%. That's a starting point, because then we have to counter in the Jim Crow era, the slave codes, the black codes, and every other type of discriminatory method they've used against the black race. We need to be thinking along those lines. ADOS family. Still others have argued that payments should come from corporations who benefited, as well as former colonial governments. Let's be clear. Instead of pointing your fingers elsewhere, the onus belongs exactly where it goes, right on the American government, who has allowed the violation of human rights carried out on black Americans, on black American descendants of enslaved Africans. You only have carried out the foul ills and behavior. You did that. Pointing your fingers at other colonial governments, unless they were directly involved, the onus, we know where it belongs. But I digress. The idea of reparations for blacks has for years been met in the American mainstream with at best contempt and at worst ridicule. Now let me stop right there. This is an atrocious insult to the human beings of this nation. It's an insult to the original people of this planet that you want to ridicule or contempt the righteous path to go to make amends for the foul, ill behavior of what you've carried out against human beings. The contempt and the insults or ridicule is unfounded. It's outrageous that so-called intelligent people would do that. But you call yourself intelligent. But for John Hope Franklin, the essential truth of American history was found not just in the large sweeping narrative, but also in the subtleties of the racial divide lived every day. His career as a historian and as an activist, he was a researcher for Thurgood Marshall for the Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education case, and marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, are well documented. Less known are his day-to-day confrontations with the legacy of white supremacy, subtleties he often related in personal anecdotes. As a 6-year-old boy, his father's business in Tulsa was destroyed. Luckily, his father survived during the infamous 1921 race riot. As one of the first black Boy Scouts in 1927, he was severely reprimanded midway through helping a blind white woman cross the street upon her discovery that he was black. In 1995, while in D.C. to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest award for a civilian, he hosted a party for friends at the Cosmos Club, where he was a member, and was asked by a white woman to get her coat, even though uniform attendants were present. Personal insults like these only scratch the surface of the economic and psychological setbacks he suffered, like countless other African Americans, at the hands of white supremacy ignorance ingrained in American culture. Insults like these were a reminder of the big picture reasons why descendants of enslaved Africans lag behind in the present. For Dr. John Hope Franklin, this was a direct result of American slavery. He says, quote, "They ought to develop some kind of modus operandi that they can do something else, something to absolve themselves of 3 centuries of guilt from which they are the direct beneficiaries," he said in a 2007 interview. Quote, "How large is the black population now living in abject poverty in this country?" he asked. "How large is the population of blacks who have poor health?" Sometimes they inherited the poor health right from their forebears who were beaten and treated like they were animals all over this country. It is true, as opponents of reparations argue, that America's troublesome history of racial inequality was born in the past, but it is equally apparent, as John Hope Franklin insists, that our future is defined by the ways we address its legacy in the present. If we really seek to commemorate him, it seems to me that the best we can do is not just pay lip service to the man. Instead, we should honor him by paying homage in the form of meaningful national policy that considers the conclusion of his life work. In other words, reparations are long past due. Family, this article again was written in 2009. It was about our late great historian, Dr. John Hope Franklin. This picture here is a picture of him late in his age. Again, the formula that they used from the Harper magazine back in 2000 about the 222,505,049 hours between the years of 1619 and 1865 is a formulation that the ADOS should consider, and we really should get more clear on what we are demanding from these reparations, not allowing the shenanigans that we've allowed in our past. Anyways, this is Guru at KSOL Black Talk Radio. Hoping you like, share, and please subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.